Chapter 2: Causes of the Cycle of Birth and Death. Sentient beings travel from one life to the next through many incarnations in a journey called the cycle of birth and death. The ultimate goal of Buddhist practice is liberation from this cycle. The root cause of our being trapped within the cycle of birth and death is clinging to a false sense of self. Once this self comes to believe in the importance of its own desires and needs, it perpetuates the cycle of birth and death by engaging in acts of greed, anger, ignorance, pride, and doubt. Buddhist sutras compare the cycle of birth and death to quicksand, a long night, an ocean, a wheel, and clouds. They say that it is like quicksand because once we step into it, it is very difficult to get out again. They compare it to a long night because it is dark and filled with insubstantial dreams that will evaporate upon our awakening. It's compared to an ocean because oceans are vast and we can become completely lost if we lose our bearings while on them. It is like a wheel because once it has begun to turn, it continues to roll. Lastly, the cycle of birth and death is compared to a cloud because it has no definite form and because it obscures the moon that is our awakened mind. Kleshas. As we journey through the cycle of birth and death, most of us notice that some sorts of thought and behavior lead to the elevation of consciousness, while other sorts lead to its decline. The teachings of the Buddha will lead us to higher levels of awareness if we follow them. If we do not, we will very likely find ourselves being drawn deeper into delusion by our habits, negative tendencies, and self-defeating behaviors. Negative traits that lead to the creation of bad karma and the perpetuation of the cycle of birth and death are called kleshas in Sanskrit. In English, they are called defilements, obstructions, impurities, obscurations, or harmful fixations. All delusion arises out of our kleshas. Delusion, in turn, causes us to do things that generate karma. Karma produces results that we feel and that cause us to react, often in much the same way that generated the karma in the first place. This cycle produces endless suffering for sentient beings trapped in it, for it is a self-perpetuating cycle, a perpetual motion machine that creates its own fuel. If we can become aware of what it is that generates delusion, we will find it much easier to free ourselves from it. There are many ways of understanding what kleshas are and how they work. Sometimes they are described as a torpor that follows us everywhere, because their subtle negative influence can be found in almost everything that we do. They can be thought of as shackles or bonds because they bind us to our habits and prevent our acquiring better traits. Or they can be thought of as covers because they hide our own best interests from us. Sometimes kleshas are called leaks or outflows because they tempt us to flow out of our natural state of goodness into the world of delusion through one or more of the six senses. Though there are many different kinds of kleshas, Buddhist tradition recognizes that just 6 of them, greed, anger, ignorance, pride, doubt, and wrong views, are fundamental to all deluded thought and behavior. These 6 kleshas are sometimes called the fundamental kleshas, or the bases of delusion, since all other negative spiritual traits can be traced back to one or more of these defilements. The treatise on the 100 Dharmas says, the 6 basic kleshas are greed, anger, ignorance, pride, doubt, and wrong views. These 6 are considered to be the most basic kleshas because they are very stubborn and give rise to all manner of physical and mental suffering. They cause great anxiety and give rise to many other secondary kleshas. In the sections below, we will look briefly at each of these defilements. Greed. Greed is characterized by excess. When our desires become so strong that they cause us to lose sleep, exercise bad judgment, behave immorally, or strain our systems, we can be sure that we are being swept away by the swift current of greed. Buddhist sutras contain many metaphors that can help us understand greed. They say that greed is like swiftly moving water, for it can quickly overwhelm us and cause us to drown. They say that it is like a nervous disease that keeps our systems overstimulated and thus makes us anxious, unable to relax, and ultimately sad. They say that it is like a flood that can sweep us into the bitter sea of suffering, or that it's like a yoke that binds us to our lower urges and forces us to work like draft animals or slaves. The treatise on the stages of yoga practice says that excessive desire or greed arises from clinging to the 5 skandhas, or to mental constructs concerning either the past, present, or future. The treatise says that greed may also arise due to bad behavior, sexual desire, family and friends, possessions, and the hope that things will either continue as they are or change. Since desire is so much a part of being human, we can assume that we will find it present in nearly everything that we do. Greed or excessive desire can also interrupt our meditation. The explication on the stages of the paramita of samadhi says that meditative states may be disturbed by 3 fundamental kinds of desire: sexual attraction brought on by the thought of someone, sexual attraction brought on by the image of someone suddenly appearing in the mind, or any other kind of desire brought on by anything else in the world. Since the meditative states bring us closer to our core emotions, it is not surprising that sexual distractions can become so prominent in meditation. The treatise on the perfection of great wisdom says, "It is hard to overcome greed, but we can learn to distance ourselves from it by taking pleasure in good things. It is difficult to free ourselves from lust, and yet we can learn to break its bonds by contemplating the impermanence of the physical form." Anger. The treatise on the perfection of great wisdom says that anger is like fire on a flammable surface. Once it has been ignited, it is difficult to stop. The treatise also says anger is the worst of all defilements and the most difficult mental disease to cure. Anger is dangerous in and of itself, but like a wildfire, its consequences can be truly terrible. For once it has begun, as the ancients used to say, its flames can burn down an entire forest of virtue. The ancients also said, when a single thought of anger arises, 1,000,000 doors of delusion swing open. Once it has arisen, anger is difficult to control. If we're mindful of our feelings, however, anger can usually be stopped in the first instant of its appearance. If you feel anger rising, do not say anything and do not give in to it. If you want to speak in anger to someone, wait 24 hours before you do that. In that time, most anger will have subsided and the situation will look very different. If you are often beset with angry feelings, contemplate the life of the Buddha and remember that all civilized behavior is founded on forgiveness and the willingness to grow beyond what we perceive as offenses against us. Anger is a powerful emotion largely because it is so uncomplicated and so easy to arouse. As Buddhists, we should turn to the wonderful virtues of patience, compassion, and tolerance whenever we are tempted by anger. For as the Ekotarika Agama says, people do not perceive the nirvana of all Buddhas due only to the flames of their anger. Ignorance. The treatise on the perfection of great wisdom says, when the little mind is out of touch with the Buddha mind, the thoughts that arise are called ignorance. Ignorance can be compared to darkness, numbness, drunkenness, poor eyesight, or confusion. Ignorance is the first of the 12 nidanas and the root cause of the cycle of birth and death. The awakening of faith in the Mahayana says that there are two basic kinds of ignorance: original ignorance and secondary ignorance. Original ignorance is sometimes also called beginningless ignorance, since its origins lie not in time, but in the qualities of our minds. Secondary ignorance includes all of the many harmful and confused thoughts and feelings that arise out of original ignorance. Ignorance begins with a single thought that cleaves to the deluded self rather than to the awakened Buddha within. It arises in minds that simply do not know any better. Mind-only Buddhists say that ignorance is a quality like sleepiness, and that it follows us from life to life and colors nearly everything we do. The hold that ignorance has on us is difficult to break, largely because it enfeebles us and causes us to have a dull understanding of our conditions. Mind-only Buddhists also compare ignorance to shackles that constrain our movements and do not allow us to defend ourselves from our own defilements. Buddhist sutras sometimes say that ignorance is the father of delusion, while passionate clinging is the mother. These parents give rise to the karma that fuels the cycle of birth and death. Pride. Pride is a harmful corruption of the normal desire for social approval or respect. The Abhidharma Kosha contains an interesting section that identifies 7 kinds of pride. The first is basic pride, the tendency to look down on others whose talents may not be as developed as our own, or to underestimate others whose talents are the same as our own. The second is excessive pride, or the tendency to look down on others whose talents are equal to or greater than our own. The third is extreme pride, or the tendency to look down on others whose talents are much greater than our own. The fourth is pride of self, or the belief that the false self is better or more important than anything or anyone else. The fifth is pride of overestimation, or the belief that one has attained levels of achievement that one has not. The sixth is the pride of low self-esteem, which means that one avoids others that one believes are more talented or accomplished than oneself, and does not seek to learn from them due to feelings of low self-worth. The seventh is perverse pride, which means that one has a high opinion of oneself, even though one can point to no accomplishment or talent to support this claim. Pride stifles learning and prevents us from growing beyond stages of development that we have already reached. Pride encourages us to rest on our laurels and stop learning new things. It is most easily countered by having a beginner's mind and approaching all situations as if they held many new and unpredictable elements, which in truth all situations actually do. As Buddhist practitioners, we must guard against all forms of pride, but especially against the pride of low self-esteem, for this kind of attitude will cause us to turn away from precisely those people who have the most to offer us. All of us should learn to admire others, for as long as we bask in the glow of admiration, we will be free of pride and open to growth. Wrong views. Right views are the first aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path. The Buddha placed them first because everything that we think, say, or do follows from our views of life in this world. If our views are seriously in error, we will make many serious mistakes. If our views are more in accord with reality, we will tend to grow and prosper both materially and spiritually. Buddhist literature generally identifies 5 fundamental wrong views. The first is the view of the body, or the belief that the body is the foundation of sentient life, and that the realities of sentient life can only be explained in terms of the body. Though our 6 senses do find expression through the physical body, the Buddha taught that the body arises only after the 5 skandhas have come together, and that the 5 skandhas are a more basic level of reality. The second kind of wrong view mentioned in Buddhist literature is a one-sided view, or any belief that emphasizes one part of the truth at the expense of the whole. For example, if we emphasize the impermanence of the physical body to the point that we become nihilists, then we will have formed a one-sided view. If we emphasize the continuance of the mind stream, as it flows from one incarnation to another, to the extent that we come to believe in an eternal soul, then we will have formed an opposite sort of one-sided view, often called eternalism. The truth lies between these 2 views. Similarly, if we say either that the Buddha became nothing after his enlightenment, or that he became something after his enlightenment, we will again be falling into the trap of one-sidedness. For the enlightenment of a Buddha cannot be described in such simple terms. A third example of a one-sided wrong view might be overemphasizing either asceticism or sensory indulgence in our practice of the Dharma, which properly follows the middle way between these 2 extremes. One-sided views can be very detrimental to reaching a complete understanding of the teachings of the Buddha, for many of the most important points made by Shakyamuni Buddha contain subtleties that, if misapprehended, can lead to serious misinterpretations. This is especially true since the truths taught by the Buddha almost always contain several different levels and will be perceived by us differently at different times in our lives and at different stages of our practice. The third kind of wrong view is called a perverse view or a twisted view. Perverse views are views that contradict such fundamental truths as the 4 noble truths: cause and effect, karma, impermanence, or emptiness. They often lead to pride and negative behavior, since people who hold these kinds of views generally do not see any reason why they should not do whatever they want to do whenever they want to do it. The fourth kind of wrong view is called a derivative view. Derivative wrong views are secondary beliefs that are founded upon a primary wrong view. For example, if we believe that the body alone is real, we may further develop the derived wrong view that satisfying the desires of the body is the sole purpose of life. The fifth kind of wrong view is called the view of morality, and it arises whenever we follow harmful moral guidelines or become rigid or moralistic by clinging to the letter of moral rules without compassionately understanding the deep principles that underlie them. The most serious form of doubt is to doubt the Buddha's teachings, or to have no confidence in them. The Buddha never asked anyone to believe what he said without testing it for themselves. But if we have so many doubts that we do not even bother to test his teachings, then we will be very unlikely to gain anything from them, much less to discover the truth for ourselves. Confidence in the Dharma is important at every level of growth. For no sooner do we reach one insight than it is time to strive for another. For example, we may gain the insight that all things are impermanent, but doubt that this applies to ourselves, and thus not understand the full significance of the Buddha's teachings on emptiness. If our doubt is very strong, it may cause us to adopt the one-sided wrong view that since life is impermanent, we can and should do whatever we want. A second example might be that though we may understand much of the Buddha's teachings on the emptiness of the self, we may doubt the significance of his teachings on compassion, and thus adopt the wrong view that Buddhist practice is based on escaping life in this world. All Buddhist practitioners have questions, and these questions are good and should be asked and answered. But when our questions close doors and lead us away from the Dharma, they become the klesha of doubt. The treatise on the perfection of great wisdom says, when we doubt, we do not seek the true characteristics of things. Doubt arises from ignorance, and thus is evil in the midst of evil. If you doubt too much, the king of death will hunt you down as easily as a lion catching a deer. Conclusion. Enlightenment cannot be described in any language. The Buddha defined nirvana as simply the extinction of suffering, or delusion, because enlightened reality is so different from what we normally see and feel that there is no way we can use our ordinary minds to comprehend it. It is as if we were huddled in a dark cave and had never seen light or known freedom of movement. How is the Buddha to describe sunlight to us? How is he to describe the freedom of movement we will experience once we've left the cave? If he tells us that light resembles the sparks that arise when we rub our eyes, will that really help us understand? If he tells us that the freedom to run resembles stretching our legs in the dark, will that convince us to get up and leave the cave? Metaphors sometimes can inspire us by comparing something we know to something we do not know. But in the case of enlightenment, positive metaphors are more likely to cause us to use our minds to diminish the goal of Buddhist practice, or to imagine that we understand it when we do not. The cycle of birth and death can be compared to existence within a dark cave. The teachings of the Buddha are designed to help us get up from the floor and leave the cave. The tunnel is dark and long, but if we closely follow the Buddha's instructions, we will find our way out. The Buddha's teachings on kleshas were designed to lead us out of the cave of birth and death, to lead us from darkness to light, and from confinement to freedom.